Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. This multifaceted probe of murder offenses, offenders, victims, and characteristics of homicide in American society breaks new ground by examining issues generally ignored or neglected among researchers. Topics include murders occurring in the workplace and in schools, those perpetrated by gangs and terrorists, those incited by bias, and intimate and intrafamilial murders. The book discusses sexual killers, serial and mass murderers, and suicide. It also examines psychological and sociological theories on murder and violence, as well as the increasing role the Internet plays in these crimes. Case studies of actual murderers are included. The book that we're featuring this evening is The Dynamics of Murder, Kill or Be Killed, with my special guest, journalist and author, R. Barri Flowers. Welcome back to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, R. Barri Flowers.
It's my pleasure, Dan. I'm happy to be back.
Well, thanks very much. You're a very busy man, like we were talking before. You've got a couple short historical short story crime, true crime, and you have some fictional stuff, and then you have this Dynamics of Murder. We'll talk about the other projects that you have, but we've got quite a bit to cover here in letting people know what this book is about. Now, in the opening, we mentioned that what really this is that there's issues generally ignored or neglected among researchers. Maybe you can start off with this examination of this book, Dynamics of Murder, with what you felt was generally ignored or neglected, and then I'll ask the inevitable question, and you can answer that question. Why would that be? Why did that occur?
Happy to. Well, I think that most criminologists, most true crime writers in particular, tend to focus more on crimes in specific, murderers in particular, serial killers, mass murderers, terrorists like these two brothers, the Boston Marathon terrorist attack,
right,
which is very important, of course, in our society, but getting to the roots of murders, the precursors to criminal and violent behavior is equally important, so that we have a better perspective on why these types of crimes continue to happen over and over again in society.
So you would say that go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that I think that as a criminologist, I've often tried to focus my criminology books on the factors that have to come together to create homicidal people in the first place. So it's just as relevant in the discussion on killers as to their motivations and precursors to their character, and what we as a society can learn from these characteristics and factors that can help us to maybe better identify these killers and deal with them once we have them in custody.
Now, you've done, this is, I think, which maybe I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I would say that this is quite comprehensive. So, and then you, again, are outlining that you've tried to examine murder from every possible perspective, which you think that really wasn't done by anyone else. That's obviously why you've done this. Is that what you're doing with this book? Is that this is just much more comprehensive? You've got every aspect of murder, homicide, whether it be suicide or again from kids and family, strangers, and then motive, sexual mass murderers. So is it this book an attempt at just being that much more comprehensive?
Absolutely. I think that's an appropriate word to describe this book, Dan. I wanted to write a book that did have a multi-layered approach to murder, including the offenders, victims, and characteristics of homicide in general in this society. I think what I've learned is that murder really comes in many, many facets and is much more than just when we hear about a murder here or there. It's we're talking about serial murders, domestic murders, school murders, mass murder, and terrorist-related murders, and you've got female perpetrated murders, juvenile perpetrated murders, and then, of course, men constitute our greatest group of killers. But what the vast majority of these murders have in common, Dan, is the use of firearms. I'd say that's our biggest issue where it concerns murder in this country and in Canada and elsewhere, too. The proliferation of firearms is really becoming a problem. I mean, it's been a problem, but it's getting worse. And that is the key element of homicides these days. A close second factor would be the influence of drugs, alcohol, or both. That tends to be a very big factor in perhaps propelling people who are potentially homicidal to follow through on their desires. But I would say that what amazes me most during my research and just my knowledge of homicides in general is how many killers actually believe they can murder someone and get away with it. I mean, that's perhaps the strangest aspect of murder, is that two people kill someone with the idea that they're going to spend the rest of their lives in prison or be on death row. I mean, people honestly feel they can murder someone or murder a group of people and still somehow slip through the net. Obviously, many of these people must watch CSI or Investigation Discovery. If they did, they realize that the authorities today have so many means at their disposal to collect evidence and identify murder suspects, such as DNA, ballistics, bloodstains, fingerprints, trace evidence, that you're far more likely to be apprehended, tried, and convicted than not. And so if people could take it from the back end rather than the front, and then maybe some of these people wouldn't commit their crimes in the first place of murder. But unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way. Most people who commit murders and the prisons are overflowing with them, convicted killers, simply thought they were smarter than everyone else, or they somehow believed in their minds that their actions somehow justified the means, which is never the case when it comes to murder. And they tend to learn it the hard way.
Well, it's not just a mistake. Let's not characterize it as just some simple misstep. Murder is a huge step for anyone, and so. And you talked about if they knew that they would get caught. But I think part of the phenomena of a lot of the killers, and you've examined, the sex slave murders, those killers, the Gallegos. You have studied some of the worst murderers and the worst murders.
Yes.
And you realize a lot of this is maybe just just another aspect of these killers is their incredible ego. That they think they are superior, and hence that they, and a lot of it is bore out in the justification for murder, that these people weren't very good anyway, or I was doing them a favor, or they were just the trash, or a lot of killers have that.
That's true, Dan. But the thing is, just about every killer that's on death row today, they tend to find, if they've been there a long time, and usually they are because of the pills process, but many of them have to be dragged crying and screaming to the execution chamber because they're so afraid to die. They don't want to experience what they dealt out on others. So I think that even for serial killers, they still don't want to get caught. Take these Boston Marathon brothers killers. They certainly didn't want to get caught, even though they knew they'd done a horrible thing. Jodi Arias didn't want to get caught. I mean, right now she's, of course, I'm sure your listeners are familiar with Jodi, and her case has been dominating the news lately, and she's, of course, been convicted and is now hoping that she can avoid the same fate that she dealt her late boyfriend. So they just, these killers, they have their various motivations, mind you, everything from profit to hatred to revenge, jealousy, collaborating with another killer, and sexual motivation, which is often the case with serial killers. But they never really look at the big picture. I mean, I've been in contact with or written about numerous murderers in prison today that now, in retrospect, they regret it. They, wish they'd done this, wish they'd done that. But this is always after the fact, not before. And so it's obviously not as easy for someone who's bent on killing someone to think about the consequences of their actions for themselves. But if they did just a little bit more, it could make a difference in what happened thereafter for them and their victims.
Well, it's very much like the pedophile that is arrested after some sort of lewd and criminal behavior involving children, young people, and then decides that they don't want to go back to prison. But that doesn't mean that they aren't still a pedophile. So they turn into a child killer. So the thing is that you could have the same sort of thing as well. Is that people would certainly there are certainly people who are, I don't know, not born to kill, but are destined to kill, and people that would certainly kill irregardless. I mean, a lot of the books that I've examined on this program have been about killers that really, why it sort of interests us, because it is such extreme behavior. The Arthur Shawcrosses, the Edmund Kempers, some of the people that keep the sex slaves in the dungeons and the torture chambers, some of these people are beyond reproach. But again, in a comprehensive study of murder, there are varying degrees, aren't there?
Yes, absolutely. Certainly there are some psychopaths out there who derive pleasure out of what they're doing, and they are motivated to keep doing it. They they feed on their own perverse thrills to do these types of acts of murder and torture. So there are definitely some killers who are lost causes no matter what. But even they still, if they had their own way, they would continue to kill, indefinitely. I mean, they don't really want to be locked up in prison for the rest of their lives, and certainly most of them do not want to die, do not want to be executed, which is the irony of it, in that they're willing to kill, and often in the most torturous of ways, and yet they still do not want to meet the same fate anytime soon. One of the things I came up with in the study of the dynamics of murder, kill or be killed, is that the Internet is beginning to play a more prominent role in homicidal behavior, which is natural. I mean, it's a natural evolution, considering
why is that? Why is that?
Plays a strong role in all aspects of society now. So the antisocial.
What do you mean? What do you mean by intimate? Tell our audience what you mean by intimate, and why do you think that's just a natural progression?
Oh, I said internet.
Trend?
I'm sorry, the Internet.
Okay, great.
So, World Wide Web, online.
Okay.
Well, I said it's a natural progression because the Internet is a big part of our society now, social media.
Right.
And so killers have also caught on, just as non-killers have, to the online world.
Sure.
So as a result, you have killers who are stalking victims the same way that they would outside the Internet. A good example is the Long Island serial killer, which I think some of your listeners may be familiar with. This is a killer that's been killing prostitutes in the New York, Long Island, for a few years now, and at least several of the prostitutes that have been murdered by this so far unknown killer advertised their services on Craigslist.
Right.
So that's one instance of how the Internet can prove to be something that could be very dangerous for people if they're on it for the wrong reasons, or if they're too gullible for predators.
Yes, I agree with you too. I agree with you. There's two cases in Canada where one was he lured his victim under the pretense that he was a woman to a garage and filmed the murder. That was in Edmonton. And then, of course, the Luca Magnotta case in Montreal, where he created an online presence through social media and Facebook for years, creating his own sort of image, and then killing a human being and defiling the body on video, and then posting that video for everyone to watch. And then, yes, the Internet's very, very important for a lot of the narcissistic killers. Some of the killers from the 70s and the 80s would have loved the Internet right now with all the ability to communicate with people, wouldn't they?
Yes, absolutely. And then it makes it that much more difficult for the authorities to track them down using anonymous chat rooms and that sort of thing on the Internet. So certainly some of these brutal killers from the past, 60s, 70s, 80s, would love to, 90s, be transported in time if they could, where they have a much wider range of potential victims and an easier way to escape detection. But I'd like to talk a little bit about Jodi Arias, if I could.
Sure.
With her case in the spotlight, she's a good example of the female killer that I studied in the dynamics of murder. Most females who kill for issues related to love, jealousy, hatred, which are often intertwined. And that's exactly the situation with Jodi. Her murder was certainly over the top. The way she stabbed this guy 20-something times and then shot him as well was definitely a brutal personal attack. And she's now hoping that she can have her life spared, most likely to spend the rest of it in prison. When I think of Jodi Arias and her attempts to lessen her own guilt while begging for her life at the same time, I'm reminded of this great movie I watched once called I Want to Live. I don't know if you saw that one or not, but it had Susan Hayward, who won an Academy Award as a woman sentenced to death for murder. She claimed she was innocent to the very end, but eventually she was sent to the gas chamber. So in Jodi's case, she may or may not suffer the same fate, but she's a great example of how jealous rage can accomplish your goal of killing someone, but at what price? To your own life and time. I mean, she's destroyed, she's the family members, her victim, they're suffering, her own family's suffering. So it pains me to hear about these types of cases where people do things in the name of love or hate in an intimate murder, and then the consequences are there for everyone to see in a case like hers.
Now, given you've just done this amazingly comprehensive study and an examination of murder from all facets and aspects and perspectives, could you have predicted, with what you know right now about Jodi Arias' background, could you have predicted any of this? Could you have predicted a possibility of such behavior as we're seeing her convicted of?
Absolutely, Dan. As a matter of fact, another true crime short that I've written, The Pickaxe Killers, just came out recently. It had another version of Jodi Arias 30 years ago named Carla Faye Tucker. Carla Faye was, while binging on drugs and alcohol, she and her boyfriend broke into an apartment of an acquaintance in Houston, Texas, and they used a pickaxe to bludgeon him and his female companion. At the time, Carla bragged that using the pickaxe actually gave her a sexual thrill. And so what goes around comes around, unfortunately, and just about every murder case that we have in this year, 2013, is simply a repeat of something that's happened in earlier generations. In the case of Carla Faye, she was convicted and sentenced to death, but it took a while, of course, for her sentence to be carried out. In the meantime, she became a born-again Christian, and the death penalty itself took center stage in this country and around the world, actually, as opponents and supporters clashed over what should happen. But similar to Jodi Arias, Carla Faye, hers was a very violent, wicked type of homicidal action on her part, and she turned her life around in prison, but not before she'd already done the deed. She eventually was executed, even though she, had expressed regrets, just as Jody has to some degree. Jody has yet to really own up, in my opinion, to her crime, but she's still relatively fresh from having done it. If she's also on death row or in prison for the rest of her life, then after she's been there for a while, she may well come to show more remorse for what she did. But again, it's still after the fact, and so that's the essence of homicidal behavior. Once you're captured and in prison for a while, just about every murderer tends to reflect and, have some second thoughts of what happened. But the key in this society, Dan, is to try to find a way to get to potential murderers, whatever their issues, to try to reach them at a stage before they take that fatal turn where there's no turning back.
Well, that's much easier said than done, isn't it? So,
that is absolutely true.
So tell us some specific, because you've written this book, you have to have come to some conclusions. You've seen the model that hasn't been working that well, obviously. What do you think as a model? What do you suggest? What have you learned from writing this?
We need to have more people, professionals, talking in the schools. We really have to start at the grade school level because children become adult killers. Some become child killers. But it's at that stage where a lot of children who become killers in the future are showing temperamental problems, other problems with behavior, showing little respect for authority or even their parents. Some kids are bullies, for example, when they're young, and that can play a factor both ways. It can cause that bully to ultimately take that to a greater level the older the person gets, or the person that's being bullied can just have this rage building up inside him or her and then end up becoming killers like the Columbine youths who unloaded their rage there. So that would be one thing I would say, is that we need to have more people trying to talk to youths in grade school and high school as well, and try to see where they're coming from. I realize this would be a huge undertaking in society when, schools are often hard pressed for funds, and society itself is usually reluctant to give taxpayer dollars to much of anything if they can avoid it. But this is one area where I think if we could give all children more counseling, gain a better perspective on how they view life, how they view themselves, how they view committing crimes, harming animals, that sort of thing. Anything that if we can have a better perspective on how they view the world around them, I think we could probably do a better job of preventing some of this behavior by trying to steer them in the right direction. A lot of killers, for example, serial killers, were also cruel to animals when they were young. But a lot of times parents may even know this, but they just dismiss it as, just a temper tantrum or something, no big deal.
Well, that alone, because there has some controversy whether, the lighting fires, wetting the beds, killing animals, having no remorse over animals, killing of them. I grew up just like a regular guy. I really did. But there was people around me, not every person, but there was some certain people around me that were very much cruel to animals, and turned out fine. I happen to know matter-of-factly, but I think the thing is that what you're talking about is idealistic, not so realistic, because then there would be a danger in the identification of certain people at certain ages because of certain behavior as destined to do certain things, so then we have to redirect them whether they want to be redirected or not. Well, so you would get the telltale. You would get the telltale psycho, probably. I think there's a combination of things here. There's a psychopath. Everybody knows who that is. And then there's the person with mental issues, which could be psychotic. And then, so there's, and then again, certainly people with no history of mental illness, and certainly probably there's witnesses to say that they're certainly not psychopathic, and yet they are killers as well. So we were dealing with a major undertaking, and then some sort of, analysis of the information that you're getting, and someone to then diagnose this as. So, in realistic terms, it's a huge undertaking that there's not very much money for, and it's not as focused as maybe it might, you might imagine, right?
Yes. Well, there's no getting around the fact that would be a tremendous undertaking and not likely to occur, frankly. But at the same time, we're going through this continual cycle of killers who, just about every killer that you hear about, ultimately people will say, well, I saw this sign of aggression, or this person displayed, some hatred toward this group, or, this person has been dealing with some issues after he was a victim of child abuse or child sexual abuse. There's just little signs, and sometimes not so little signs, that are always there for killers, that if we, had some sort of indication of this, we may have been able to offer them some sort of help, psychological or otherwise, that could have made a difference. So, we can't just continue to deal with these issues after the fact, because all that's doing is just, we're getting them off the street, which of course is a great thing, and we're trying them and convicting them, sending them to prison or executing. So that's a good thing to deal with the aftermath of homicides and other violent behavior, but it still isn't addressing the problem of trying to prevent it in the first place. One other thing in that respect is we may need to reassess the means by which violent offenders are released from prison. I mean, there's been numerous instances where killers were let out, or other violent types were released from prison through the normal means, parole, but then they went on to kill someone else, or to kill someone for the first time, using the violent tendencies and the violent environment they may have picked up in prison to then follow through and commit some of these heinous crimes from the outside. So there's just a number of different angles with which we can look at this, but we certainly need to try to do more as a society to prevent these killings, or at least put out a concerted effort to do so before they occur.
Well, you're dealing with parole boards, and parole boards can be lenient or or extremely hard on inmates that are up for parole, for early release. There are notorious stories of Arthur Shawcross, Edmund Kemper, all kinds of examples of people that had murdered, were deemed cured or rehabilitated, or they were a few years later were released and then reoffended. Now, the thing that only can really happen is that's what pushes these movements towards having mandatory minimums and people saying, well, no parole, murder without the possibility of parole. In Canada, we have a system where there is no such thing as there's no death penalty, and no death penalty since the 70s, and we have no mandatory, it's 25 years to life. I mean, you could probably spend the rest of your life in prison, but most people are given parole in that 25 years or less and then released out into the community, supposedly rehabilitated just during the years of incarceration, I guess. So, but we don't have any murder without the possibility of parole. The thing is, the parole board can get it wrong.
Well, they certainly can, and but I understand on the one hand that if someone is deemed to be rehabilitated and they serve their time, they may deserve a second chance at trying to lead a law-abiding life, but we just have too many recidivists, frankly speaking, that continue. I mean, it's like they were just on pause while they were in prison.
Yeah.
And then, pick right up where they left off. As scary as I thought that is. But
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised by that at all, and I've seen that trend here as well. People that were released involving a homicide are reoffending in short order. So I wouldn't doubt if I see them 3 times before the courts for somebody's death. So, I'm not surprised. And I'm a big supporter of, you committed murder, you've over this boundary that's set by society, and I can't feel sorry for, I don't feel sorry for killers. I just don't feel sorry for killers. Now, I'm interested in defenses and self-defense, and I'm open-minded, but I reserve my sympathy for victims and victims' families, and I just don't have any sympathy for killers. So, that extends to, I don't care about the rehabilitation, because I don't think society does anything for the rehabilitation of the victim or the victim's family, or certainly not enough for the victim or the victim's family. Barely any consideration for the victim and the victim's family in the court, in the trial, in the appeal, in the parole, the anything. So that's where I am. I'm more interested in, I hate to say it, but truthfully, I've never been a victim. I'm lucky, but I can empathize with the victims, and the killers are way, way down on my list of people to care for the rehabilitation.
Well, we're on the same page there, more or less, Dan. I think that victims should certainly be front and center where it concerns trying to help them to deal with the victimization or their, the family members of victims. The book that I wrote, the bestseller, The Sex Slave Murders, with the serial killer couple, Gerald and Charlene Gallego,
right.
The father of one of their victims recently talked about how painful it is for him, even though it's been 30 years since his daughter was shot to death and sexually assaulted by Gerald Gallego, that it's just pain that his daughter's gone. He never got a chance to be a grandfather to her children, or even she didn't even get to get married. Her fiance was also gunned down by Gallego. So the point is, the victims the victimization never goes away. If you're the family member of the actual victim, it's can still carry you as well for a lifetime. So it's the whole umbrella of victims that you have to deal with, along with the primary victim is already gone. But it's all those that are left behind that has to deal with the mess, frankly, of someone murdering loved one like that. And so I definitely think that victims need to be given more attention in helping them to cope and deal with the loss and trying to carry on and trying to make sense of it all, although sometimes you can't make sense of it. I mean,
no.
It's sense most of the times, in fact, killing people for various reasons that defy logic or common sense, but they still do it, killers, for their own purposes. Even, the most minor. I mean, some killers, for example, may kill someone that they robbed for a couple of dollars, and it either wasn't enough money or they still felt they had to kill the person so the person would identify them later. Then, of course, they are identified later through either security cameras or CSI teams collecting evidence. They're going to get caught 9 times out of 10, and then, they're going to have to face the consequences of their actions. But so often they never look ahead at the end game for their murderous behavior, and that includes men, women, and children. Children, that's one of the interesting aspects of the dynamics of murder that I studied. For juvenile killers, there's long been a debate in society as to whether they're culpable or not. Are they responsible for their actions, or were their brains simply not developed enough to fully appreciate what they've done, the life or lives they may have taken? And that is certainly a debatable question. But on the whole, I say that if you're old enough to do the crime, especially if you're 15 and up, then you have to be held accountable. You just can't give teenagers or juveniles a free pass under the belief that they simply hadn't developed the maturity level enough to fully be able to comprehend their actions, especially when you consider in modern times juveniles are smart enough to be able to grasp the Internet and its complexities, and they are just, in my opinion, I think juveniles are far more mature in the ways of the world than when I was a teenager. And so it's difficult to say that this same juvenile that can handle these violent video games, can handle the Internet, can drive, can handle, are very able with their computers, but they still can't understand if they go out and kill someone that they're trying to rob, or even for kicks, if they, under the influence of drugs or something, and they decide to just go after someone just for the fun of it. But then later,
okay, but what's the, Barry, what's the number though? Where do you get the number though? There's 15, 14. There's kids being on death row in Florida, 11. The kids going on on 12. Now, how do you get your number, and then how do these other people get their number then? Because it's 12 and 14 in a couple states, right?
Well, actually, I believe that the death row is off the table for juveniles to a certain age across the country. I believe is the case now.
Regardless, I mean, what do you call being put up to adult court? Why do you say 15? And for those people that are saying no, 12 and 14, How is their argument? What's your argument for 15?
That's a great question. Well, I think that the 15-year-old, I simply believe that they're more cognizant of what they're doing. I think that's an age, in my opinion, I believe that's the age where they cross over enough into adult thinking, especially where it relates to violent crimes. If you take your father's gun and go out and shoot someone with it, I feel that at that age, it's an age that is questionable. I'm sure some people feel it should be, like you said, maybe 13 or 14 or 17 or 18. But I just feel that there has to be some cutoff one way or the other, and I'm willing to allow that someone that's 13 or 14, 12 or 10 may well not have the skills, the motor skills, the mental development that can fully comprehend what they're doing if it involves murder. But at the same time, they still have to, even if they're not in adult court, if some 13-year-old or 12, as has been the case, more often than not, more often than you might think, has been the perpetrator of rape or some other crime of violence, I definitely think that they need to be held as long as they possibly can, even if it's in juvenile custody. But, a lot of the people regarding putting violent juveniles in adult facilities, I could understand the issues there, especially if they're put in the general population. I mean, that wouldn't be a very good thing for them. So I would say they just may have to, if they're tried in adult court and they're still minors, they'll just have to have them isolated from the general population, but that still would be better than putting them in if they've shown a propensity for enough violent behavior. We still wouldn't want them put in a juvenile facility where they then might be in a position to victimize other juveniles. So it's really a tightrope there, Dan, to tell you the truth, regarding.
Well, again, most people, it's you're worrying about the one juvenile that goes in with the other juvenile criminal killer. I mean, I'm never talking about minor crime. I'm talking about major crime, rapists,
right,
pedophiles,
absolutely.
and killers.
Right.
I mean, no one's caring. No one's caring what any of those people do to each other. That's the whole thing. That's what we're faced with. Society-wise, people used to go to public hangings. Now they do not shed a tear when somebody complains about the food or the conditions in prison. They're complaining that they have to pay for it.
That is true. Yes, unfortunately.
The thing is that what I have a problem with is sort of looking at the bigger picture when you're looking at murder. Some of the I'm interested in some of the trends, and I want to ask you this one question too, because you in your analysis, what is it about? There are notorious wicked women killers, so they have the capacity, whether people believe it or not, to kill like men never even thought of, or to kill at the same level as men, or to kill, to be able to have the capacity, the propensity to kill. But what is it about men in your analysis, to everything you've looked at? Why is the murder the domain of man?
Well, that is also a good question. Certainly men are by far more likely to kill. They dominate the prisons as far as killers are concerned. I think men represent about 90%, more than 90% of the murderers in prisons today. But there, I would say that it's in the nature of men, I think, more than women to kill, because they generally tend to be the aggressors in their upbringing from, the early in life till they're older, and women are more passive in their roles, social, sex roles in society. So men just, they tend to play out on those aggressions more than women. Females are traditionally caregivers, and they just are the softer side, if you will, of in general, not in specific. There's certainly plenty of women and teenage girls who have done some, atrocious crimes of violence and murder. Yeah. But generally speaking, men are still males, men and boys sometimes as well. They just grow up with a more machismo type character, and this can evolve into behavior that becomes violent, and they're stronger as well physically by and large. So, for example, if you've got a domestic violence situation, the male is more likely to be the perpetrator if it comes down to murder, even though the female may have still been equally a party to the violence in the relationship, but she still doesn't get the male. She's more likely to get the lion's share of the violence. But there are exceptions. For example, the Jodi Arias case, she says that they had domestic violence in their relationship, and she claims she was afraid for her life and that sort of thing. Whether that is true or not, I'm not sure. I mean, there's been no corroboration for what she said. But the fact is, she was definitely the aggressor in this instance. I mean, she stabbed the fellow over 20 times, shot him in the head. She was clearly the one that was in the driver's seat, so to speak, as far as a brutal murder. So women can be capable of really heinous crimes, but men just are almost bred, if you will, to be the more aggressive and violent type of person in society, and that's been borne out by the fact that men are far more likely to kill, whether it's domestic violence, terrorism, mass murder, school shootings. I mean, just about every type of crime, gang murders, every type that you can think of, you think of male killers because they are the ones that rule the roost, you might say. Is
it an aggressive society that nurtures aggression but is it a man's aggressive nature? Is it our primal
I think it's both.
nature?
I think it's man's aggressive nature, but it's also a society that tends to it sort of gears
allows
males from to be involved in this type of behavior. It's rough and tumble football in the backyard, sure. Wrestling. It's just we have a society that almost rewards males in a way in terms of being successful in their various pursuits that involves aggression when they're young, and so this can escalate to homicidal behavior at some point, whether they're young or older. And women females growing up, just generally speaking, aren't brought up the same way with the same perspective on how they should behave, how they shouldn't behave. And so that's why males tend to be more prevalent in violent behavior. And also the element of substance abuse cannot be understated. Substance abuse is perhaps the strongest factor, I would say, in homicidal behavior for males and females. In just about all instances, the person is under the influence, the killer, of alcohol, drugs, and often both. So that's a key element. But males still have it's just, it is, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's genetic per se, but their mental and physical makeup, I believe, over the years, what they're taught, their environment, their family members that may also have their male family members that may be involved in criminal activity, or they could still be pushed into it by even their female family members that can go to male family members to help them deal with problems of their own, and expect, as part of the expectations that can have men or boys resorting to violence to achieve their means. And sometimes that goes into homicidal behavior.
But did drugs cause the homicidal behavior, or did the drugs enable that person to enact that homicide that they had the propensity of doing anyway?
The drugs were just the
catalyst?
Means to put them over the top. They certainly had the homicidal tendencies to do it, to perpetrate the crime, but they may have needed something to give them that extra edge, an excuse, if you will, to follow through on what they wanted to do. So it certainly is not something that one can use as an excuse when they decide to murder someone. That's just something that gives them the impetus to move forward. It sort of loosens the inhibitions.
Right. Now, you've included
I'd like to,
case studies.
talk a little bit about my latest project that I think listeners would find fascinating, Murder at the Pencil Factory.
Right.
No, we're running out of time here, but if I could just get in
go
a
ahead.
little...
Yeah.
Okay, Murder at the Pencil Factory, The Killing of Mary Fagan, 100 Years Later, is my latest historical true crime short. It's really a very compelling case that occurred 100 years ago, April the 26th, 1913, as a 13-year-old Mary Fagan was murdered at the National Pencil Factory in Atlanta, Georgia, where she worked putting metal strips around the pencil. She was sexually assaulted, battered, and strangled. And she was found in the basement of the pencil factory. A Jewish-American factory superintendent named Leo Frank was arrested, tried, and eventually sentenced to death for her murder in a controversial trial in which the prosecution's chief witness was an African-American janitor at the pencil factory named Jim Conley, who claimed that he helped Leo Frank move the body after the fact to the basement. And so, based largely on his testimony, Leo Frank was convicted And though he was sentenced to death, the governor at the time decided to commute his sentence to life. But there in the Deep South, with some problems between the various elements who lived there, Jewish, whites, African Americans, the powers that be in the community decided that Leo Frank was guilty and he should be executed. So he was broken out of prison by a lynch mob and lynched.
Wow.
Nearly 100 years ago, it was a couple of years after the actual murder of Mary Fagan, but this case has generated a lot of controversy ever since then because Jewish Americans feel that Leo Frank was railroaded. Others feel that the janitor may have been the real killer, and others feel, yes, someone else may have been responsible for the young girl's death. But I think that your listeners will find this story very interesting because it has a lot of elements. In fact, it reads like a legal thriller of today, only it happened a century ago, and there's a lot of different angles to the story for people to consider as they, try to come to terms with it in their own thoughts about who may have been responsible for Mary Fagan's death at age 13.
Right. Yeah, interesting. And you have tell us about is the Pickaxe Murders a true crime short story?
Yes, it is. The Pickaxe Killers is the story of Carla Faye Tucker and Daniel Garrett, which I mentioned earlier,
right,
who murdered a couple in Houston, Texas, in 1983, and used a pickaxe to beat them to death, and a very violent crime. Carla Faye Tucker, who was the one that was responsible for most of the pickaxe hits, she ultimately was sentenced to death. Her boyfriend at the time died in prison before he got the chance to be executed. Carla was executed eventually, but not before she turned her life around and gained a lot of sympathy from high places like the Pope and other people that had power around the world, including actors, but her fate was sealed. But I think those reading this story will also find it a compelling historical true crime tale dealing with a vicious murder and the death penalty and the consequences of murder, and just will allow you to take a look at the society we live in and wonder what we can do to try to change some things. But I found it ironic with the Jodi Arias case that she is an example of how we seem to be in a cycle of these types of vicious crimes by females and in some instances males too. But I thought about the Carla Faye Tucker tale ever since Jodi Arias has been in the news, because some people tend to think that this type of crime, is new in our society. And I can tell you that it's gone on, for centuries now. And Belle Gunness, at the beginning of the 19th century, was a cold-blooded female serial killer. So what goes around truly does come around when it comes to crime. And I'm sure that in the future we'll hear about other Jodi Ariases that have done terrible things, murdered someone for reasons that really there's no good reason, even if you try to convince others that you killed the person for this reason or that, unless you're defending yourself from being killed, there's no excuse for killing someone else. So in my book, The Dynamics of Murder, Killed or Be Killed, that's often the essence of homicide. You're going to be a victim or an offender. And hopefully, if you're fortunate enough, you can avoid both, because obviously there's not a good outcome either way.
Yes, absolutely. Before we go, I just wanted to say, too, that you have case studies, and we didn't get into exactly who any of these people are. But just briefly, you could tell us, I'm going to name some people that are in the case studies, and then you can just tell us why you chose these people, and then just briefly tell us why you did that. The person is Sahel Kazemiya?
Yes,
Sahel
Kazemi. Yes, I chose that particular case because she murdered her boyfriend, who is an ex-NFL star. It was a murder-suicide, actually. Yes, she felt that Steve McNair, for listeners I'm sure may be familiar with him, he was played with a couple of teams, Baltimore, I believe he was an NFL quarterback, and this happened in 2009 in Nashville, and I chose that particular case because it was somewhat unusual in the sense that most times it's a male-female suicide. The male is the killer, female is the victim. But in this case, she was jealous of the fact that Steve was seeing someone else. He was married at the time, by the way, when he was seeing her, but he still had another girlfriend apparently, and Kazemi was upset at the prospect of losing him, so she decided if it couldn't be her, it would be no one. So she shot him to death while he was asleep and then shot herself. Real tragedy, but it illustrates, nevertheless, how women, if firearms are part of the equation, they can be every bit as dangerous and deadly as men. And that showed, was proof positive right there. And because she committed suicide, she couldn't be tried even for her crime.
Sure. Why did you include Charles Stewart, and who is he, briefly?
Charles Stewart, I included him because he murdered his wife in 1989 in Boston. But the interesting thing with this case is after he shot his wife to death, hoping to cash in on an insurance policy, and he had a girlfriend as well, he used the race card that, no one ever likes to imagine that happening, but he said that initially that an African American had shot his wife and wounded him. He had a superficial wound, and so at the time, the authorities nationwide were questioning African American males, especially in the Boston area, but even in other states too, as this built to a fever pitch in the media. But then his case began to fall apart, and the authorities realized that his wound was self-inflicted, that he had murdered his wife, hoping that he could get her out of the picture and collect some insurance and be with his girlfriend. He ultimately killed himself before he could be arrested and charged. So I thought that was a good case study to examine, because of the implications of using race as a means of trying to throw off the authorities on the real killer. I mean, that's a powerful tool that can be used by someone who is trying to avoid taking responsibility and knowing that race relations then and even now aren't what they should be. So he was exploiting that for his own means, but it didn't work.
Sure. Now you've also included Sarah Marie Johnson and Byron Uesugi.
Yes,
we won't go into that, and also Gerald and Charlene Gallego,
yes,
which is the subject of your sex slave murders. We won't go into all of that, but you've included these very unique killers as well as case studies in the dynamics of murder, and you've got everything from trends in homicide to the dynamics of murder itself, the circumstances, the characterizing the murder offender. You've studied the victim, you've studied suicide, interrelationships, kids killing parents, parents killing kids, females killing their spouses, and vice versa. You've really done a great job in covering all of the aspects of murder, the motives, the breakdown of the types of killers and motivations, and, like you say, a lot of the factors that go into sort of creating the confluence of events that leads to murder. So you've done a great job in capturing this in the dynamics of murder, Barry. And I want to thank you very much for this interview.
And that was certainly my intention to give readers a broad perspective on the crime of murder and the various angles with which it occurred, and the victims, offenders, society itself, the law enforcement. There's just a lot of sides to every murder that I felt needed to be explored, so people could appreciate the various facets of murder beyond just an individual victim or offender, as is often the case, when we hear about our daily murders around the country, which are, very sad to hear. But we also need to have some context on these crimes, yes. Who's committing them, why, and what patterns, what we can learn from them, how we can try to prevent or at least contain this worst type of crime that can occur in society.
Absolutely, and the one that captures our imagination as well. That's why we read true crime books, and that's why we read these type of books that are one step beyond true crime in trying to understand murder and the murderer and trying to avoid victimization. But I think we just all are fascinated by murderers themselves and the crimes and the effect that it has on, again, society, cities, communities, families, and just everyone, because we're still talking about crimes 100 years later, like
right.
your murder in the pencil factory. So,
right.
Yeah,
well, I would like to invite listeners, true crime fans, to not only read these projects of mine, but also some of my other bestsellers, The Sex Slave Murders, Serial Killer Couples, yes. and Masters of True Crime. And all of those
right.
are in ebook, print, and audio.
Yeah,
and also, I was going to say,
tell us about your website,
you can
Barry.
also follow me on Twitter and Facebook, Wikipedia, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and www.rbarryflowers.com.
You got it going on. You're one big promotional machine there, Barry. I want to thank you very much for this interview, and I'm sure to hear from you again, because you're just one prolific guy, and you're just I don't know how you do it, but you're down there in your basement or whatever, and just
yes,
working at it.
Not much social life, Dan. I just try to use my skills to bring to the attention of the public some of these crimes and why they're happening, and just keeping people informed and knowledgeable. I think that true crime writers, have a place in society. We're sort of obligated to
Absolutely.
show people more than what you just hear on the 11 o'clock news, where it concerns crimes of violence.
Yes, to tell the stories and then the stories behind the stories as well, because that's all people really do is get a little sliver of information out of context, like you say. And so this is the way to do this, is for the dedicated true crime authors like yourself that are out there, and for the dedicated true crime fans, there's this give and take of information and then a welcome audience that's ready to hear about it and ready to read about it. So I applaud you for your work, Barry, and I want to thank you very much, and have yourself a good evening, and we will probably talk to you real soon.
I look forward to that, Dan, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Barry. Good night.
Hey, have a good evening.
You too.